Welcome back to the Historian's Tome. Tonight we'll journey back to ancient China, to an age of poetry, silk roads, and imperial splendor. The Tang Dynasty ruled for nearly 3 centuries, creating one of the most brilliant civilizations the world has ever known. Before we begin, if you enjoy these sleep stories, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Are you drifting off to sleep in New York, London, or perhaps somewhere in Asia? We love hearing from you. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let us transport you to the golden age of China. In the early years of the 7th century, China was broken and divided. The great Sui dynasty, which had briefly united the land, collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions. The second Sui emperor had pushed his people too hard, building grand canals and waging costly wars. Rebellions erupted across the empire like wildfires in a dry forest. Warlords carved out their own territories. Farmers abandoned their fields. The ancient dream of a unified China seemed to be crumbling into dust once again. In this time of chaos, one family saw opportunity. The Li family had served as nobles under the Sui dynasty, holding important military positions in the northern regions. Li Yuan was a respected general, a man of middle age with keen eyes and a strategic mind. He governed the region around Taiyuan, a stronghold in the mountains of Shaanxi province. As the Sui government weakened, Li Yuan watched and waited. His second son, Li Shimin, was a young man of exceptional talent, brave in battle and wise beyond his years. It was Li Shimin who convinced his father that the time had come to act. In 617, Li Yuan raised the banner of rebellion. His armies marched south from Taiyuan toward the Sui capital of Chang'an. The campaign moved swiftly. Other rebel leaders had exhausted themselves fighting each other, but Li Yuan had prepared carefully. He had secured alliances with Turkish tribes to the north, ensuring his supply lines remained safe. His soldiers were well trained and disciplined. Within a year, his forces captured Chang'an, the great capital city that had stood as the heart of Chinese power for centuries. Li Yuan declared himself emperor in 618, taking the title Emperor Gaozu. He named his new dynasty the Tang, after his hereditary title as Duke of Tang, but Gaozu understood that conquering a capital was not the same as ruling an empire. Rival warlords still controlled vast territories. Some claimed the imperial throne for themselves. The new Tang dynasty would need to prove itself in battle many times over before China would truly be united again. The task of military conquest fell largely to Li Shimin, the emperor's second son. Though not the eldest, Li Shimin showed genius in military strategy. He was not a man who relied on brute force alone. Before each campaign, he studied his enemies carefully, learning their strengths and weaknesses. He used speed and surprise, striking where his opponents least expected. He was also generous in victory, welcoming defeated warlords into his service rather than executing them. This won him loyalty from former enemies. Battle after battle, Li Shimin's armies swept across China. In the east, he defeated the mighty warlord Wang Shichong, who had proclaimed himself emperor of a rival dynasty. In the west, he crushed the forces of Zui Rengao, another pretender to the throne. The northern territories fell, then the southern regions. With each victory, more territory came under Tang control. But success on the battlefield created tension at home. Li Shimin's older brother, Li Jiancheng, was the crown prince, the designated heir to the throne. As Li Shimin's fame grew, so did Li Jiancheng's jealousy and fear. The crown prince began to see his younger brother not as an ally but as a threat. Court factions formed, some supporting the crown prince, others backing the victorious general. The palace in Chang'an became a place of whispers and plots. The crisis came to a head in the summer of 626. Li Shimin learned that his brothers were planning to kill him. The crown prince and another brother, Li Yuanji, had allied together. They convinced their father that Li Shimin was growing too powerful, that he harbored ambitions for the throne. An order was prepared to strip Li Shimin of his military command, which would leave him defenseless against his enemies. Li Shimin decided he had to act first. On a morning in July at a place called the Xuanwu Gate, one of the northern gates of the Imperial Palace, Li Shimin and his loyal soldiers laid an ambush. When the Crown Prince and Li Yuanji rode through the gate, Li Shimin's archers shot them down. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Li Shimin himself shot an arrow that killed Li Jiancheng. The Crown Prince fell from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The violence shocked the court. Emperor Gaozu, confronted with the fait accompli, had little choice. His eldest son was dead, killed by his second son. But Li Shimin controlled the military and had the support of key generals. Within months, Gaozu abdicated the throne, retiring from political life. Li Shimin became the second emperor of the Tang Dynasty, taking the reign named Taizong, which means Grand Ancestor. He was just 28 years old. The bloody path to power would haunt Chinese historians for centuries. Some saw Li Shimin as a patricide and traitor. Others defended him, arguing he acted in self-defense against brothers who would have killed him. But what none could deny was what came next. Emperor Taizong would prove to be one of the greatest rulers in Chinese history, a man whose wisdom and justice would define the golden age of the Tang Dynasty. Emperor Taizong understood that he came to power through violence, and this shaped how he ruled. He knew that history would judge him harshly for killing his brothers unless he proved himself a great emperor. So he dedicated himself to becoming exactly that. He surrounded himself with capable advisors, and remarkably, he actually listened to them. In Chinese history, this was rarer than one might think. Many emperors viewed criticism as insubordination, but Taizong encouraged his officials to speak honestly, even when their words stung. One of his most famous advisors was a man named Wei Zheng. Wei Zheng had actually served the Crown Prince, the brother that Taizong had killed. After the incident at Xuanwu Gate, many expected Taizong to execute his brother's supporters. Instead, recognizing Wei Zheng's intelligence and integrity, Taizong made him a high-ranking minister. Wei Zheng became known for his blunt criticism of the emperor. More than 200 times he openly contradicted Taizong in court, and more than 200 times Taizong accepted the criticism and changed his policies. Once, Taizong wanted to build a grand hunting park that would require displacing many farmers from their land. Wei Zheng stood before the entire court and said the plan was wasteful and would harm the people. Taizong, though he loved hunting, cancelled the project immediately. On another occasion, Taizong wanted to wage war against a distant kingdom. Wei Zheng argued the campaign would be too costly and bring little benefit. Again, Taizong listened and held back his armies. When Wei Zheng died in 643, Taizong wept openly and said he had lost a mirror in which he could see his own faults. This willingness to accept criticism was part of a larger philosophy of government that Taizong embraced. He believed that the emperor's primary duty was to serve the people, not to indulge himself. He kept taxes low, even though this meant less money for his own luxuries. He reduced the number of government officials, cutting out positions that existed only to enrich lazy bureaucrats. He reformed the legal code, making punishments less harsh and more consistent. Under the old system, laws varied from region to region and were applied unfairly depending on one's social status. Taizong wanted a system where everyone, from nobles to peasants, faced the same laws. The emperor also invested heavily in education. He expanded the imperial examination system, which allowed men of humble birth to enter government service based on their knowledge rather than their family connections. Schools were built across the empire. The curriculum focused on the Confucian classics, ancient texts that taught moral philosophy and proper governance. Taizong believed that a government staffed by educated, morally upright officials would naturally be more just and effective. He was largely proven right, But Taizong was not only a domestic reformer, he was also a brilliant strategist who understood that China's security required strong borders. To the north, the Eastern Turkic Khaganate posed a constant threat. These were nomadic warriors who had raided Chinese territory for generations. Rather than simply defending against them, Taizong decided to strike at their heartland. In 630, he sent a massive army north. The campaign was a complete success. The Eastern Turks were defeated so thoroughly that they submitted to Tang authority. The tribal Khans came to Chang'an and declared Taizong the heavenly Khagan, recognizing him as their overlord. This victory opened up the Silk Road trade routes that connected China to Central Asia and beyond. Merchants could now travel safely, carrying silk, porcelain and tea westward, bringing back gold, silver, horses, and exotic goods from Persia and even as far as Rome. The flow of trade brought enormous wealth to the Tang Dynasty. It also brought new ideas, new religions, and new peoples. Chang'an transformed into a truly cosmopolitan city, home to merchants and monks from a dozen different nations. Taizong's armies also moved west into the Tarim Basin, the desert region that formed a crucial link in the Silk Road. Various city-states and kingdoms dotted this region, places with romantic names like Kucha, Khotan, and Kashgar. Some submitted to Tang authority peacefully, others required military persuasion. By the end of Taizong's reign, Tang influence stretched further west than any previous Chinese dynasty had reached. The empire was becoming vast. To the east, Taizong faced a different challenge. The Korean peninsula was divided among three kingdoms, and one of them, Goguryeo, controlled much of what is now northern Korea and southern Manchuria. Goguryeo was powerful and had resisted Chinese attempts at domination for centuries. Taizong believed that bringing Goguryeo under Tang control was necessary for securing the empire's eastern frontier. He launched several campaigns against the kingdom, but these proved far more difficult than his other military ventures. The first major campaign came in 644 and 645. Taizong personally led the army, crossing into Goguryeo territory with hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Initial victories came quickly. Tang forces besieged several cities and some fell, but Goguryeo's defenders were tough and resourceful. They had fortified cities, and they knew how to fight on their mountainous terrain. As winter approached and supply lines stretched thin, Taizong made the difficult decision to withdraw. It was one of his few military failures. The emperor never forgot this setback. He planned to return with an even larger army, but his health began to fail. Years of campaigning and the stress of ruling had taken their toll. In 649, at the age of 50, Emperor Taizong fell seriously ill. He summoned his officials and his son, the crown prince, to his bedside. He gave them final instructions on governing the empire with justice and wisdom. Then, on a summer day, the great emperor closed his eyes and died. Taizong's death marked the end of an era, but his legacy lived on. He left behind an empire that was unified, prosperous, and powerful. His government reforms would shape Chinese administration for centuries. His military victories had secured the borders and opened trade routes. Future generations would look back on the reign of Zhenguan, the period when Taizong ruled, as a model of good governance. Even today, historians regard him as one of China's greatest emperors, a man who turned the violence of his youth into wisdom and compassion in his maturity. After Taizong's death, his son took the throne as Emperor Gaozong. He was a very different man from his father. Where Taizong had been forceful and decisive, Gaozong was gentle and often indecisive. He was not weak exactly, but he lacked his father's commanding presence. In the early years of his reign, the empire continued to function well, largely because Taizong had left behind such strong institutions and capable administrators. But soon, a remarkable figure would emerge to dominate the court in ways no one expected. Her name was Wu Zhao, though history would come to know her as Wu Zetian. She had entered the imperial palace as a young concubine of Emperor Taizong. but after his death, she was sent to a Buddhist monastery, as was the custom for concubines of deceased emperors. However, Gaozong had noticed her during his father's lifetime. She was beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she was intelligent and charming. After becoming emperor, Gaozong brought Wu Zhao back to the palace, scandalizing the court by taking his father's former concubine as his own. Wu Zhao was ambitious in a way that few women of her time dared to be. The empress at that time was a woman from the Wang family, but Wu Zhao saw this as merely an obstacle to overcome. She used her influence with Gaozong to gradually undermine the empress. Court politics became a battlefield. Wu Zhao was ruthless. There are accounts, disputed by some historians but repeated by many, of Wu Zhao killing her own infant daughter and blaming it on the empress, though the truth of this story remains uncertain. What is certain is that by 655, Wu Zhao had convinced Gaozong to depose the empress and make Wu Zhao empress in her place. It was an unprecedented move that shocked the traditional Confucian officials who believed women should remain subservient and certainly not wield political power. But Wu Zhao, now Empress Wu, was just getting started. As Gaozong's health declined over the years, suffering from chronic illnesses that left him weak and often bedridden, Empress Wu took on more and more of the day-to-day tasks of governing. She attended court sessions hidden behind a screen, as was proper for women, but everyone knew she was making the decisions. Gaozong would consult her on every important matter. Gradually, it became clear that Empress Wu was the real power behind the throne. She was an effective administrator, it must be said. She promoted officials based on ability rather than aristocratic birth. She encouraged agriculture and ensured food supplies remained stable. Under her influence, the empire continued to prosper. When Gaozong died in 683, Empress Wu's position became more complicated. Her son became Emperor Xuanzong, but he was young and showed signs of wanting to rule independently. This would not do. After only a few weeks, Empress Wu deposed her own son and replaced him with another son, Ruizong, who was even more pliable. But ruling through puppet emperors satisfied her less and less. In 690, Empress Wu took a step that no woman in Chinese history had ever dared. She declared herself emperor. Not empress of a male emperor, but emperor herself. She changed the name of the dynasty from Tang to Zhou, claiming she was starting a new ruling house. She was 65 years old. The Confucian establishment was horrified. Women were not supposed to rule in their own right. It violated every social norm, every teaching about proper order in society. Yet she had done it, and she commanded the loyalty of the army and most officials. Those who opposed her too loudly found themselves demoted, exiled, or worse. Wu Zetian, as historians call her, ruled as emperor for 15 years. Her reign was marked by both accomplishments and terror. On the positive side, she was an able administrator who continued the policies that made the Tang Dynasty prosperous. She further opened up the bureaucracy to men of talent regardless of their family background. She was a patron of Buddhism and sponsored the construction of magnificent temples and statues, including the famous Longmen grottos with their giant carved Buddhas. However, she also maintained power through fear. She employed a network of secret police and informers. Anyone suspected of disloyalty could be arrested, tortured, and executed. Prominent officials, including members of the old Tang aristocracy, lived in constant fear. Some historical accounts paint her as exceptionally cruel, but modern historians debate how much of this was true and how much was exaggeration by male writers who were scandalized by a woman holding power. The empire's borders remained secure during her reign. The military campaigns continued, expanding Tang influence further into Central Asia. At one point, Tang armies reached as far west as the borders of Persia. Chinese garrisons stood guard over key points along the Silk Road. Tribute missions arrived at the capital from dozens of foreign kingdoms, bringing exotic gifts and acknowledging Tang supremacy. By any objective measure, the empire was at or near its peak power, but Wu Zetian was growing old and rivals waited in the wings. In 705, when she was 80 years old and gravely ill, a group of officials led a coup. They forced her to abdicate and restored her son, the former Emperor Xuanzong, to the throne. The dynasty's name changed back from Zhou to Tang. Wu Zetian died later that same year. The official history, written by men who despised her, judged her harshly. Yet, she had held supreme power for more than 4 decades, first behind the scenes and then openly. No other woman in Chinese history would ever match this achievement. After Wu Zetian, the Tang Dynasty entered what many consider its true golden age. Xuanzong's reign was troubled, but his successor, Emperor Xuanzong, who took the throne in 712, would preside over the most glorious period in Tang history. The early decades of Xuanzong's rule saw unprecedented prosperity. The population grew, cities flourished. Arts and culture reached heights they would not see again for centuries. The empire was at its zenith. During the Tang Dynasty, and especially during the long reign of Emperor Xuanzong, Chinese culture flourished as never before. Chang'an, the capital, became the largest city in the world. Over 1 million people lived within its walls, and perhaps another million lived in the surrounding areas. The city was designed on a grid pattern, with wide avenues running north to south and east to west. The Imperial Palace complex in the northern part of the city was like a small city itself, with thousands of buildings, gardens, and halls. Walking through Chang'an's streets, you would hear a dozen different languages. Merchants from Persia wore their distinctive robes and sold carpets and jewels. Buddhist monks from India, wearing saffron robes, debated philosophy in monastery courtyards. Turkish warriors, serving as guards or soldiers, practiced archery in military camps. Arab traders brought glassware and precious stones from distant lands. Korean and Japanese scholars came to study Chinese arts and government systems, which they would take back to their own countries. The markets of Chang'an sold goods from across the known world. Chinese silk, of course, was prized everywhere, woven in colors and patterns of incredible beauty. Porcelain dishes, which the Chinese had perfected, were so fine they were almost translucent. Tea had become popular, evolving from a medicinal drink to a daily pleasure. From the west came horses, especially the famous heavenly horses from Central Asia, which Chinese nobles prized for their speed and stamina. Spices like pepper and cinnamon, glassware from Rome, and exotic fruits found their way to market stalls. Religion in Tang China was diverse and generally tolerant. Buddhism, which had arrived from India centuries earlier, had become deeply embedded in Chinese life. Monasteries dotted the landscape. Some were small rural temples where a few monks lived simple lives. Others were vast complexes with hundreds of monks, extensive lands, and great wealth. The most devoted Buddhists became monks or nuns. But ordinary people also participated by making offerings at temples, observing festivals, and trying to live according to Buddhist teachings of compassion and detachment. Taoism, the native Chinese religion emphasizing harmony with nature and the pursuit of immortality, also thrived. Taoist priests performed rituals and created elixirs that they claimed could extend life. Emperors and nobles often patronized Taoist masters, hoping to unlock the secrets of longevity. Confucianism remained the foundation of government and education, teaching proper relationships and moral behavior. These 3 traditions, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, coexisted and often blended together in Tang society. Other religions found homes in Tang China too. Christianity arrived in the form of Nestorian churches brought by missionaries from Persia. A famous stone tablet, the Nestorian stele, still exists today, describing how Christianity came to China in the 630s. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion of fire worship, had temples in major cities. Even Manichaeism, a religion that blended Christian, Buddhist, and Zoroastrian elements, found followers. Jews and Muslims also established communities. The Tang emperors generally allowed all these faiths to practice freely, as long as they did not threaten political stability. But the Tang dynasty is perhaps most famous for its poetry. This was the supreme art form of the era. Every educated person was expected to compose poetry, and the very best poets achieved fame and prestige that rivaled high government officials. Poetry competitions were held at parties and official gatherings. Poems were exchanged as gifts. They expressed love, celebrated friendship, mourned loss, praised nature, and commented on politics. The two greatest Tang poets were Li Bai and Du Fu. Li Bai was a romantic figure, a wanderer who traveled across China, writing poems about the beauty of nature, the joys of drinking wine, and the sadness of parting from friends. His poems had a spontaneous, flowing quality, as if they were composed in a moment of inspiration. Stories say he was drunk much of the time, finding clarity and creativity in wine. One famous legend claims he drowned trying to embrace the reflection of the moon in a river. Though this is probably not true, Du Fu was different. His poems were more structured, more serious. He wrote about the suffering of common people during times of war and hardship. He criticized corruption and injustice, though always carefully to avoid directly attacking the emperor. While Li Bai celebrated life's pleasures, Du Fu contemplated its sorrows. Together they represented two poles of Chinese poetry, and both were considered masters beyond compare. Thousands of their poems survive to this day, still read and admired. Music and dance were also highly developed arts. The Tang court maintained orchestras and dance troupes. Musicians played instruments like the pipa, a pear-shaped lute that produced haunting melodies, and various flutes, drums, and stringed instruments. Dances ranged from slow, graceful performances to energetic numbers with swirling sleeves and complex footwork. Emperor Xuanzong himself was a patron of the arts, and reportedly composed music and trained dancers personally. Painting during the Tang Dynasty reached new levels of sophistication. Landscape painting became especially important. Artists sought to capture not just the physical appearance of mountains and rivers, but their spiritual essence. A good painting was like a poem without words, conveying emotion and meaning through composition and brushwork. Figure painting also flourished, with artists creating portraits of court beauties, Buddhist deities, and scenes of daily life. Most Tang paintings have been lost to time, but the few that survive show incredible skill. The scholarly class spent years mastering calligraphy, the art of beautiful writing. Every brushstroke had to be perfect, balanced between structure and spontaneity. The greatest calligraphers were revered as artists of the highest order. Their works were collected and copied. Even today, Chinese calligraphy remains an important art form, and Tang Dynasty examples are studied as supreme achievements. This cultural golden age was possible because of prosperity and peace. Farmers produced surplus crops. Trade routes were secure. The government functioned efficiently. People had time and resources to devote to arts and learning. The examination system meant that talented individuals could rise through study and poetry composition, creating a large class of educated officials and scholars who valued culture highly. For a few brief decades, everything seemed perfect, but perfection never lasts. Even as poets wrote their verses and artists painted their masterpieces, forces were gathering that would shake the Tang Dynasty to its foundations. Emperor Xuanzong, who had been such a capable ruler in his youth, was growing older and more distracted. His attention turned from governance to pleasure, and into his life came a woman whose beauty would, according to legend, destroy an empire. In his later years, Emperor Xuanzong fell deeply in love. The object of his affection was young Guifei, a woman of extraordinary beauty. She had originally been married to one of Xuanzong's sons, but the emperor wanted her for himself. He arranged for her to become a Taoist nun, dissolving her marriage, and then brought her into his own harem. Young Guifei became the emperor's favorite concubine, and his obsession with her grew until it consumed him. Xuanzong was no longer the focused, hard-working emperor of his early reign. He spent his days in the company of young Guifei, listening to music, watching dances, and enjoying the pleasures of the palace. State affairs were neglected. Yang Guifei's relatives were promoted to high positions, even though many were incompetent or corrupt. Her cousin, Yang Guozhong, became chancellor, essentially running the government. But Yang Guozhong was no Wei Zheng. He used his position to enrich himself and punish his enemies rather than serve the empire. The military was also changing in ways that would prove dangerous. In earlier Tang times, soldiers were recruited from farming families and served for limited periods. This citizen army had been effective but had limitations. As the empire expanded and border defense became more important, the Tang government increasingly relied on professional soldiers, including many foreigners, especially warriors from Turkish and other Central Asian tribes. These soldiers were more skilled in combat, but they were also loyal to their immediate commanders rather than to the distant emperor. One such commander was a man named An Lushan. He was of mixed Sogdian and Turkish ancestry, a large man who was reportedly so fat he needed help mounting his horse. But he was also an excellent general who won victories on the northern frontier. An Lushan was clever and knew how to play court politics. He ingratiated himself with Yang Guifei, and she in turn praised him to Emperor Xuanzong. The emperor came to trust An Lushan completely, even treating him almost like a son. An Lushan commanded 3 of the empire's most important frontier armies. He controlled hundreds of thousands of soldiers. As he grew more powerful, some officials at court became worried and warned the emperor that An Lushan might be dangerous. But Xuanzong refused to believe that his trusted general would ever betray him. Yang Guifei defended An Lushan as well. The warnings were ignored. In 755, An Lushan launched a rebellion. His armies swept south from the frontier toward the capital. The attack was sudden and devastating. The Tang government, unprepared after decades of peace, struggled to respond. Local militia and hastily assembled armies tried to stop An Lushan, but were crushed by his veteran troops. City after city fell. Within months, the great eastern capital of Luoyang was in rebel hands. The rebellion sent shockwaves through the empire. How could this happen to the mighty Tang Dynasty? The answer was that the empire, for all its cultural brilliance, had grown complacent. Its military was not as strong as everyone assumed. Its government was riddled with incompetence thanks to the promotions of unqualified people like Yang Guozhong, and its emperor was too distracted by his love affair to notice the danger until it was too late. In 756, An Lushan's armies approached Chang'an itself. Emperor Xuanzong, finally understanding the severity of the crisis, fled the capital with Yang Guifei and a small entourage. They traveled west along mountain roads, hoping to reach safety in Sichuan province. But the emperor's own soldiers were angry and frightened. They blamed Yang Guifei and her relatives for the disaster. When the group stopped at a small station called Mawei, the troops mutinied. The soldiers killed Yang Guozhong and other members of the Yang family. Then they surrounded the building where Yang Guifei had taken shelter. They demanded her death, claiming she had bewitched the emperor and brought ruin to the empire. Xuanzong tried to protect her, but the soldiers would not back down. Finally, to prevent a complete mutiny, the emperor agreed. Yang Guifei was taken away and either hanged or forced to strangle herself. She was 37 years old. The emperor was devastated but had no choice but to continue his flight. An Lushan captured Chang'an and declared himself emperor of a new dynasty. But his rebellion, while militarily successful at first, began to fracture. An Lushan was not a good ruler. He became paranoid and cruel. In 757, his own son murdered him. The rebel forces split into factions. Meanwhile, the Tang government regrouped. Xuanzong's son took effective control and was later recognized as Emperor Suzong. He recalled loyal armies from the frontiers and, crucially, sought help from outside. The Uyghurs, a Turkish people who controlled territory to the northwest, agreed to send armies to help the Tang dynasty. In exchange, they demanded payment and trading privileges. It was a humiliating necessity, but it worked. Combined Tang and Uyghur forces recaptured Chang'an in 757 and Luoyang in 758. The rebellion continued for several more years, degenerating into brutal regional warfare that devastated northern China. Finally, in 763, the last rebel strongholds fell. The An Lushan Rebellion was over, but it had lasted 8 years. The destruction was catastrophic. Modern historians estimate that tens of millions of people died, either killed in fighting, starving due to disrupted agriculture, or fleeing as refugees. Entire regions were depopulated. Cities that had been thriving centers of culture were now ruins. The government had lost control of vast territories. Although the Tang Dynasty survived, it was fundamentally weakened. The empire never fully recovered. Central government control loosened. Regional military governors, who had been granted power to fight the rebellion, became effectively independent rulers of their territories. They collected taxes but sent little to the capital. They raised their own armies and passed their positions to their sons, creating hereditary military dynasties within the empire. The emperor in Chang'an was still recognized as the legitimate ruler, but his actual power was limited. Emperor Xuanzong abdicated in favor of his son during the rebellion and lived his remaining years in sorrow, never recovering from the loss of young Guifei. Poets would write about their love story for centuries, sometimes portraying it romantically, other times as a cautionary tale about how obsession can destroy an empire. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Xuanzong had been a great emperor in his early years, but power, age, and love had clouded his judgment when it mattered most. After the An Lushan Rebellion, the Tang Dynasty limped on for another century and a half, but it was never the same. The glorious cosmopolitan empire of the early Tang was gone, replaced by a realm struggling with internal divisions and external threats. Yet, even in decline, the dynasty produced moments of brilliance and fought hard to maintain its legacy. One of the major problems the later Tang faced was economic. The rebellion had disrupted trade routes and destroyed agricultural land. Tax revenues plummeted. The government had also taken on enormous debts to foreign allies like the Uyghurs, who had helped suppress the rebellion. To make matters worse, powerful regional governors hoarded tax income in their territories. The central government, strapped for cash, struggled to maintain basic functions. Emperor Taizong, who ruled from 762 to 779, tried to address these problems with limited success. He implemented reforms to the tax system, trying to make it more equitable and easier to collect. He also worked to rebuild the economy by encouraging agriculture and repairing irrigation systems that had been damaged during the war. These efforts helped stabilize the empire somewhat, but the fundamental problem of weak central authority remained. The examination system continued to function, producing educated officials, but the quality of government declined. Corruption became more common. Powerful families and regional governors could place their favored candidates in official positions regardless of merit. The ideal of government by the most talented was eroding. Factional politics at court became vicious, with different groups of officials fighting for power rather than working together for the empire's benefit. Buddhism, which had flourished during the Tang Golden Age, became controversial in the later period. Some emperors and officials saw Buddhist monasteries as a problem. They owned vast amounts of land that was tax-exempt. Thousands of monks lived in monasteries without contributing to agricultural production or military service. The government estimated that monasteries controlled significant portions of the empire's wealth while contributing nothing to state coffers. In 845, Emperor Wuzong launched a major persecution of Buddhism. He ordered thousands of monasteries closed and their land confiscated. Hundreds of thousands of monks and nuns were forced to return to secular life. Buddhist statues and texts were destroyed. It was the most severe religious persecution in Chinese history to that point. The persecution ended when Wuzong died the next year, and Buddhism was allowed to return, but it never quite regained its former dominance in Chinese society. The persecution had lasting effects on the religion's role in China. Meanwhile, external threats mounted. The Tibetan Empire, which had grown powerful to the west, raided Tang territory repeatedly. In 763, Tibetan armies even briefly captured Chang'an itself, though they could not hold it for long. The Tang had to abandon many of its western territories, losing control over much of the Silk Road. Trade revenue declined. The once mighty empire was contracting. To the north, other nomadic groups rose to replace the Turks as major powers. The Khitans, who would later establish the Liao dynasty, began raiding the northern border. The Tang military, weakened and underfunded, struggled to defend against these incursions. Some frontier regions were simply abandoned, left for the nomads to control. Within the empire, other problems festered. Secret societies and bandit groups proliferated, especially in areas where government control was weak. Peasant uprisings became more common as taxes remained high, and local officials became more corrupt. The most serious of these uprisings began in 875, led by a man named Huang Chao. Huang Chao had been a salt smuggler, one of many men who made their living evading the government's salt monopoly. When he failed the imperial examinations, unable to become an official through legitimate means, he turned to rebellion. He gathered an army of disaffected peasants, smugglers, and bandits. His forces swept across southern China, growing larger as desperate people joined his cause. The rebel army moved like a flood across the empire. They captured Guangzhou in the south, then turned north. City after city fell to them. The Tang government sent armies to stop them, but these forces were defeated or simply melted away as soldiers deserted. In 880, Huang Chao's forces reached Chang'an itself. The emperor fled, just as his ancestor had during the An Lushan Rebellion. The rebels entered the capital, and Huang Chao declared himself emperor of a new dynasty. But Huang Chao was no administrator. His forces looted Chang'an thoroughly. The great cosmopolitan city, which had survived for centuries, was devastated. Foreign merchants were killed. Palaces were burned. The destruction was immense. The rebel regime could not actually govern, existing mainly to extract wealth from the territories it controlled. Regional governors who had nominally submitted to the Tang government now had to decide whether to support the rebels or remain loyal to the dynasty. One of these regional governors, Zhu Wen, had initially joined Huang Chao's rebellion, but then switched sides back to the Tang. He was a brutal and ambitious man who saw opportunity in the chaos. With his army, Zhu Wen helped Tang forces recapture Chang'an in 883. Huang Chao fled and eventually died, possibly by suicide in 884. The rebellion was over, but like the An Lushan Rebellion before it, the damage was catastrophic. The Tang dynasty was now emperor in name only. Real power lay with regional military commanders like Zhu Wen. These men controlled their own territories, raised their own taxes, and commanded their own armies. The emperor could issue decrees, but whether anyone obeyed depended entirely on whether the regional commanders chose to recognize his authority. It was a fiction of unity, barely concealing a fractured realm. Emperor Xuanzong, who took the throne in 888, tried desperately to restore imperial authority. He was intelligent and capable, but the situation was beyond saving. The regional commanders were too strong and too independent. Xuanzong attempted to play them against each other, forming alliances with some to counter others. For a while, this strategy kept him in power, but it was a dangerous game. Zhu Wen, who had grown even more powerful after defeating Huang Chao, became the dominant military figure. He controlled the region around the old capital and had influence over several other commanders. Emperor Xuanzong tried to counter Zhu Wen's power by allying with other generals, but Zhu Wen was too strong. In 904, Zhu Wen forced the emperor to move the capital from Chang'an to Luoyang, which was in territory Zhu Wen controlled. This made the emperor essentially a prisoner. Later that same year, Zhu Wen had Emperor Xuanzong murdered. The emperor's 9-year-old son was placed on the throne as Emperor Ai, but everyone knew he was just a puppet. Zhu Wen ruled in all but name. He eliminated officials who were loyal to the Tang Dynasty. He killed members of the imperial family who might challenge him. He was preparing the way to take the throne for himself. In 907, Zhu Wen forced Emperor Ai to abdicate. The young emperor signed documents giving up the throne to Zhu Wen. Shortly after, Emperor Ai was killed, probably poisoned. Zhu Wen declared himself emperor of a new dynasty, the later Liang. The Tang Dynasty was over. It had lasted 289 years, from 618 to 907, making it one of the longest dynasties in Chinese history. The end of the Tang Dynasty marked the beginning of a period called the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms, a time of division and warfare that would last for several decades. China would not be truly unified again until the Song Dynasty emerged in 960. The brilliant Cosmopolitan Empire was gone, existing now only in memory and in the poems, paintings, and histories it left behind. Yet the Tang Dynasty's influence did not end with its political collapse. Its cultural achievements continued to shape Chinese civilization for centuries. The poetry of Li Bai and Du Fu remained the gold standard of Chinese verse. The administrative systems developed during the Tang provided models for later dynasties. The examination system, though it had faltered in the late Tang, was revived and would continue for another 1,000 years. The Buddhist art and architecture of the Tang period influenced all of East Asia. The memory of the Tang Golden Age became a reference point, a model of what Chinese civilization could achieve at its best. Later dynasties looked back to the Tang with admiration and tried to recreate its glory. Even today, overseas Chinese communities often call themselves Tang people, a testament to how deeply this dynasty embedded itself in Chinese identity. The name Tang became synonymous with Chinese culture itself. The fall of the Tang teaches us that even the mightiest empires are fragile. The same dynasty that once commanded respect from Central Asia to Korea, that built the world's largest city and created sublime poetry, could collapse into chaos. Internal divisions, military rebellion, and the concentration of power in the hands of regional strongmen destroyed what centuries of careful governance had built. Yet, even in collapse, the Tang left behind a legacy that would outlive any individual emperor or general. As we drift towards sleep, we can imagine the streets of Chang'an at its height, the wide avenues filled with merchants from distant lands, the sound of poetry being recited in garden pavilions, the sight of Buddhist temples with their curved roofs and golden statues, the taste of tea becoming fashionable among the elite, the rustle of silk robes as officials hurried to morning court sessions. All of this existed once upon a time in a dynasty that burned bright and beautiful before fading into history. The Tang Dynasty showed humanity what was possible when different cultures met and mingled, when government served the people rather than just extracting from them, when art and learning were valued as highly as military conquest. It was not perfect. No human society ever is. There was cruelty and injustice, war and oppression. But there was also brilliance, creativity, and moments of genuine wisdom. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let sleep take you, perhaps you can see the Silk Road stretching across deserts and mountains, connecting east and west. Perhaps you can hear the poetry of Li Bai celebrating the moon and wine. Perhaps you can feel the ambition of Emperor Taizong trying to create a just government. Perhaps you can sense the cosmopolitan energy of Chang'an, where the world came together in one magnificent city. The Tang Dynasty is gone, but its stories remain. These stories remind us of the heights human civilization can reach, and the fragility of even the greatest achievements. They teach us about ambition and wisdom, love and duty, creation and destruction. They connect us to people who lived more than 1,000 years ago, but who felt the same emotions we feel, who dreamed similar dreams and faced familiar struggles. Rest now, and let the story of the Tang Dynasty carry you gently into sleep. Let the weight of history become a comfort rather than a burden. These events happened long ago in a distant land, yet they speak to something timeless in the human experience. Empires rise and fall, cultures flourish and fade, but the stories endure, passed down through generations, keeping alive the memory of what once was.